The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, your host for the day. We're going to be having a wonderful guest coming in a little while. We have Paul Engle coming in. He is the director of the Brockton Public Library, and I suspect that you're going to find a lot out about libraries that you didn't know. Conventional wisdom is that libraries have books. They have way more than that. And so we'll hear from him. But first of all, I had a couple of thoughts going on and something really positive. This past week, we in Massachusetts were happy to find that we were voted the number one place state in America to live. I am not surprised by this, and I've said this a number of times on this particular podcast. Massachusetts is a place that is incredibly inclusive compared to many other states. And the things that they identify around quality of life are the schools. Last week, Governor Healy passed into legislation the idea that everybody who goes to school, public school in Massachusetts, has a free lunch. It isn't a free lunch anymore. It's just lunch. Think about that for anybody who has had to be known as the kid that has the free lunch. Now it is just a rite of passage for every family in the state of Massachusetts that their child will get a nutritious meal in the middle of the day, which we all know 26% of Americans have food instability. So it really is a great stride forward and something that you would not find in many, many other states. The other thing is the education itself. We're ranking up there number one or two in many polls in terms of the education that we offer to people. And number three, of course, is our investment in our infrastructure in the state, which brings in high-tech companies and big business. So all of that combined means that we are the best place to live in America. I will say that the downside to that is that we were voted the 41st most expensive place to live. But that, of course, is about supply and demand. People want to come here. Educated people want to come here. They want to pay the taxes that support the infrastructure. And of course, that drives up the housing costs, etc. So we cannot forget, as we've talked about on this program before, the fact that new Americans, folks coming into this, into maturity and adulthood, find it very hard to get on the ladder in terms of home buying, which of course is the most important thing for transgenerational wealth is actually home ownership. We've got a ways to go on that, but I believe that the governor has a lot of plans for affordable and working housing in this state, which will only make this place a better place to live. It's also not by coincidence, but just by date. We're coming up on Labor Day. Labor Day is a holiday where many of the kids rue that day coming around because they're going back to school. Although I have heard that many kids are desperate to get back to school to see their friends this year. But Labor Day, of course, is a celebration of the American worker, the people who have created the wealth in this country to make this country the most wealthy and best country in the world. And it made me reflect on what it's like to be a worker in this country. It depends where you live, it depends where you are, but certainly in our state, there are plenty of rules that protect workers. There are plenty of politicians who know that workers' rights must be preserved. And it's a fine balance between our ability to allow businesses to make money and pay taxes, but make sure that our workers get a fair deal. Unionization in this country is the lowest that it's been for 60 years, but it's growing. It's coming back, and the labor market, the labor force is now having a say because workers in this state and all over America are very, very scarce at the moment. So it's not a bad place to be as we come up on this Labor Day. And I would like to say to all of the workers in America, happy Labor Day. We'll be back in a minute with Paul. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
And welcome back, everybody. And as promised, we have a very special guest today. We've got Paul Engle in the studio. Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
Hi, Peter. I'm great. How are you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, you too. And for those people who don't know, in and around Brockton, Paul is the director of the Brockton Public Library. And so we're going to talk a little bit about libraries today. And I did a little bit of research about this, and I found out that the first library was actually in the 7th century BP, and it was called Ashbanipal. And it was a great little story because there's 30,000 of these clay rectangles that have Sanskrit, I think, written into, and they were baked in the sun. And it was just such a wonderful story about way back 7th century BC. There were libraries. Libraries have been with us probably for longer than many, many other things, which is a testament to our desire to learn, our desire to be creative and all of those things. And speaking of creative, I do want to take a couple of minutes to talk about you, Paul, if that's all right, before we get to the library, because I think there's a natural through line to that, as far as I can see. Now, am I right in saying that you are a graduate of Berklee School of Music?
I am. I was on the 10-year plan. I started in the 80s and ended in the 90s.
Wow, and what a journey that was, right? Then I think you ended up at the Stan Getz Library, is that right?
I did. After Berkeley, I went down to North Texas, and I got my degrees in library science and music down there. And then I got a call from my old boss. I worked at the Berkeley Library when I was a student, and I wanted to get out of an unpaid practicum down at North Texas. And when we were on the phone, he said, boy, I could really use somebody up here to help me move the paper catalog to an online catalog. And I said, well, how about me? And he said, you're hired. So before I hung up the phone, I had a job. And that was in 95.
Yeah, tough job interview there. And just before we came on the air, when we met, we talked about our experiences seeing Stan Getz. And we're of that generation that is very, very lucky to have seen a wonderful musician. But many of that, just talking about how you became, you did library studies, so you were on that track. You spent a lot of time in academia, and then you ended up in Brockton. Can you give us a thumbnail of how that happened?
Well, after a long career at Berkeley that lasted over 20 years, it's safe to say that Berkeley and I broke up, and it was time for me to move on. And there was about the same time that was happening, Brockton was looking for a director of their library system. And I thought about it, and I had never really been to Brockton. I'd been here for a gig and jury duty. That was it. So I
hope they both went well.
Yes, they did. And I applied for it, thinking, well, let's see. I'll just go to the interview and see what happens. And I went to the interview, and it was the panel was a group of trustees, maybe 4 or 5 of them. And they grilled me about, what's my commitment to ESL, programming? What's my commitment to, helping, homeless shelters and food pantries? And by the time I left that interview, I was a little bit shaken, because I didn't really have good answers for them. Although I said I must have said something right. Yeah. And I was also very, very intrigued, and so I felt very good after the interview, and when I left the interview, I felt like I had the job. You have that feeling. Yeah. Yeah. And so I waited a little bit. They had some things they had to sort out with their previous director, and a little bit of time passed, and I got a call from the trustee chair, and they offered me the job, and I took it. I thought, well, if it's a good fit, I'll know within a year. Yeah. If it's not, give me a year to figure something else out.
Yeah. And 7 years later.
And 7 years later, I'm still here, and I'm pretty much parked here. I'm really digging what I'm doing. I worked at Berkeley for a long time, and I can say that at Berkeley, the student is the one you're serving, and that can mean one thing, or it can mean another thing altogether. When I moved into Brockton and started working for the Brockton system, all of a sudden the people that are my constituents, the people I'm serving, they need ESL, they need citizenship, immigration information. They need access to materials, to in all sorts of formats, in print materials, serials, in online materials. They need access to technology.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying Brockton is a fairly poor community. And so offering these services, the response is overwhelmingly positive, heartfelt appreciation for what we do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So much so that I'll be at Market Basket and I'll be walking down the aisles, shopping for my groceries, and people will come up to me and thank me for what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it must be really amazing. I was thinking about this the other day, and debate me on this, but I was thinking the world has changed an awful lot over the last even 50 years, right? The notion of a library might be one of the most democratic decisions that any city or town decides upon. I think about the great libraries of the world, and Boston is one of those.
Absolutely.
And the libraries in London and in Europe and everywhere. And this is a decision that is made by town elders, leaders, that they will create a place initially where people can come and learn and read when they couldn't afford to get those materials, right? The question I asked myself was, in this day and age, I wonder if the idea of libraries was, we didn't have libraries and the idea of libraries came up, we would still say, yes, that's a good idea.
It's a hard question to really wrap your brain around, because we've had libraries since the 7th century of BCE.
That's right.
I think of the great libraries at Alexandria that we unfortunately burned down, but we can only imagine. And I think that there's a need for humans to understand what we're doing here, and that manifests itself in art, in the arts, I should say, and it manifests itself in kind of trying to understand our world, and that's information. And information is nothing until you process it and create something from that information.
And you have an environment where you feel safe,
right?
That is warm,
exactly.
And you think about libraries as this place where they have books, right? Mm-hmm. But peel that onion. Yeah, peel that onion for a little bit. What else is it? Well,
it's a lot. I mean, you said it. It's a safe space, and it's a space where everybody is welcome. You're not allowed entry by your socioeconomic status. You're not allowed entry based on your education. Everybody can come to the library. In the Brockton Public Library, if you've been in, we have a rotunda with a mural in it, and over the makerspace door it says the public library, the People's University, and that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
You can go into a library in this country, and for absolutely no cost to you, you can get access. You can pretty much educate yourself as if you were going to a university, if you have the discipline and the desire to do that. And then you have people there who are trained to help you along your way, to help you guide you through that information, because there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah, just going back to what we were talking about before, this sort of the most democratic. I mean, it really is. If you ask me, what you just said, this is the People's Public Library University. It strikes me as the most sort of egalitarian move that you can possibly make in a community. I worked with a guy a few years ago. His name is Steve Pemberton, and he actually ran for Congress in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. His story is remarkable. Taken away from his parents as a child and placed in a foster home in New Bedford, where he was horribly abused. Mm-hmm. And at the age of 9, he was in another foster home, and he would have to sit outside and wait until his parents got home every night for hours on end, cold, whether it was warm or cold. And he'd sit on this wall. And one day, a neighbor came by with some books and said, "Young man, I see you here every day. Do you like to read?" And he said, "Yes." She gave him the books, and he immediately fell in love with reading. Oh. Fell in love with the world, right? Mm-hmm. With geography, with history. He wrote a book, and the book was called A Chance in the World. Reason the book's called A Chance in the World was because child welfare worker wrote in the notes when he was going through this child does not stand a chance in the world. He says that my journey towards, by the way, he's the chief diversity officer of Walgreens USA now, my journey began with a book. And on the other side of that book was somebody who cared about me. And that, to me, is just this amazing story. I bet that happens all the time.
It happens, yeah. You just have to be able to be aware enough to see it, because you don't see the whole journey. And I tell people this all the time. When you're at your job in your library, you're helping somebody, you don't really ever see the results of what you're doing, and you don't see how what you're doing in that moment transcends into other people's lives and spirals into this web of interconnectivity. And it's a powerful thing if you really think about it. That's a powerful story you just told.
I love that image, though. That image of you're at the center of the pond, and these
ripples.
sort of waves and ripples just keep going,
and they interact with other ripples.
And occasionally, right? Occasionally, somebody comes up to you and gives you that feedback. Multiply that by 1,000, 2,000, 3,000.
Occasionally, somebody writes that book.
Yeah.
And that's just one book. And you're right. How many thousands of stories are out there that never get written down?
But, I guess the conventional wisdom about libraries for people who live in, affluent towns is, that's somewhere I can get a book or whatever.
Yeah. Take with me on the plane to the Bahamas.
That's right. But it's so much more than that in gateway cities, isn't it?
Sure.
What else are people getting when they come in?
Well, let me tell you a story about one thing we have. We have I got some money from the federal government through our Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners, which is a wonderful institute. We could talk about that for hours. I could praise them to the end of the day. But they gave big gateway cities a grant through ARPA money to buy something, anything. We had no strings attached.
Wow.
So Brockton, we concocted the idea. We bought a mobile planetarium.
Really?
It seats about maybe, I'm going to guess now, maybe 20, 25 kids. And probably less adults, and it's basically it's a planetarium. It's a mobile planetarium, and we tour that all around the state.
How amazing! Did you go last night? Because I think last night was
the supermoon or something like that. Yeah. My daughter dragged me out to see it.
I wasn't too impressed. I've got to say.
I was too tired. I go to bed early. But anyway, the mobile planetarium has gone. It's incredibly popular in Brockton. We take it to Fall River. We've taken it to Hull. We've taken it to all sorts of communities.
So a school can call up and say, "Can we book the planetarium?" Is that how it works?
Yeah, it's part of our Library of Things collection.
Yes,
So a Library of Things collection is a real departure from the traditional book, or magazine. We have things that we check out. We have musical instruments, guitars, basses, mandolins. We have, and I'm a musician, so of course we have all that.
A lot of musical
you can check out other libraries. We may have this too. Cooking, like pans and pots and pans and things like that. A mobile planetarium. We have a giant outdoor screen and projector for movies.
That's incredible.
The sound system.
I'm so glad I asked.
And it's not just Brockton. Every library has those.
Yeah.
And we all have something unique, because any collection is going to have the biases of the people who are collecting.
That's right.
That's why Brockton has a ton of musical instruments, drum sets, percussion instruments, where Hanover, and I'm not picking on Hanover, but they may have another bias that might have, culinary stuff or yard, weed whackers and things like that. It just depends on the bias of the person that's doing the collecting.
That's so wonderful.
And Massachusetts is set up so that you have your one library card. You can get access to anything in the state for free. Yeah. And we have a delivery system that will bring it to you, or bring it to your librry and you pick it up.
I have been the joyful recipient of many of those interlibrary loan situations.
Yes.
When I think about what a library does, when we've had this discussion. When my kids were little, we didn't have a great deal of money, and we lived in Somerville, and we were able to go down to the Somerville Library and take out tickets for the museums.
Passes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, museum passes are very popular, and our museum pass program is underwritten by the Mass Cultural Council, as many of them are in the state. So there's also funding. Massachusetts is a great state.
It really is.
When you come right down to some of this stuff. But the museum pass program, you have passes to various museums. Again, the person who's collecting for your library is going to present their bias and have their what they think is we should have, and that might be different in Somerville. There may be overlapping too, but any young family can come in, take out the passes, use them, go to the Museum of Fine Arts, go to the Whaling Museum in New Bedford. We have the Norman Rockwell House out in, where is that, out somewhere in
Adams.
I think it's Adams. So we have all these great passes, and they're wildly popular. And usually it's how people find out about it is they have kids. The kids are expensive.
What am I going to do with these?
And what do I do now? They grow up, and so you can't just go to the MFA is expensive. But then they hear from a friend in a play group, libraries have these passes, and so the word of mouth spreads. And
isn't that wonderful?
It is wonderful.
And I was talking before you came on the air about what a wonderful state Massachusetts is, because we're celebrating that Massachusetts has been voted the #1 place to live in a recent poll.
Wow.
And that's what it is, right? That's about the availability of things. Mm-hmm. Now, it's the 41st most expensive place to live. But what this state does is provide opportunities for people through public libraries, through other means as well, which I think is a really important part of our culture and also our community.
Yeah. Well, about the community aspect of it, the CFO for Brockton, when I met him, he said to me, the public library in any community is I'm going to butcher what he said, but it is the bellwether, how your community, how the world sees your community. If your public library is strong and good and healthy, then the community is strong and good and healthy.
That's so true.
It is true.
Yeah, and you think of all the stalwarts of community, right? The local church, the local pub.
Sure.
Certainly in my community, and the local library are really the sort of building blocks of what sort of comes in the hinterland of that. So I think so. So we have a couple of minutes left. The future of libraries. It is true that books are being less read, but there's other ways to listen to books. I think it's called a Kindle, right?
Kindle, playaways.
Some people love the feel of a book in their hands, and I don't know whether that's a generational thing. It's not actually, because a lot of
it's not. My 25-year-old daughter is a book person. Like me.
Yeah. So with this changing world, we'll always want to read. People will always want to write. How is the library going to play a different role, or is it going to play a different role?
I think libraries have become community centers, where anybody can gather for whatever reason they have, as long as it's not hateful or hurtful, and express their ideas and present their ideas. I know that Boston has a unique thing. They have I guess not that unique anymore. They have a whole center for entrepreneurship up at the Copley branch. Yeah. I want to do that. I don't have the room. I'm trying to figure that one out for Brockton.
Well, maybe that's something we should talk about, because our helpline is talking about how do we change from an organization that hands out things to people when they're in need to giving them the skills and that they need, so they don't have to come back to helpline. That might be a collaboration.
Maybe we can let's talk about that off air. Yeah,
I'd love to do that.
We're developing a mobile makerspace that we will take to like schools. So we'll go to the Kennedy School with our makerspace and do projects with them there, because we're starting to see that. It started back in my day in high school. The music programs were eliminated. Then they started eliminating other things, and now they're eliminating like science programs. And so we're thinking, well, we can step up and fill that gap and take our makerspace out to the public. Yeah. So that's another way we're changing and adapting to what we're seeing going on around us.
That's just wonderful ingenuity. It really is.
Yeah, and the sky's the limit. And in Brockton, we are well supported by our community. We are well supported by our politicians, by our delegations, our mayor, and we have the ability and the opportunity and the sincere desire to help our community in any way we can.
Wow, what a wonderful way to finish, Paul, because we began by saying, hey, we're pretty cool in Massachusetts, and this is why. Yeah. And I think you've just ended on a wonderful note. Thank you so much for coming
Peter,
in.
thank you for having me.
And I do hope you'll be able to come in and talk about
absolutely
future projects.
Yep, give me a shout.
Thanks so much. Goodbye, everybody.